I never imagined the man I'd meet in a dimly lit bar would not only see through my carefully crafted smile but would also unravel my entire world. That night, when Ethan tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear and whispered, "You deserve to be noticed," I felt something awaken in me, a dangerous desire I couldn't resist. What started as a quiet escape became the storm that destroyed everything. For 15 years, I believed I had built an unshakable marriage. Mark and I had our ups and downs like any couple, but I always thought we were solid, a team navigating life together. He was reliable, hardworking, and responsible, qualities I admired when we first fell in love. But somewhere along the way, the spark that once burned bright between us began to dim. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion, the kind no one warns you about. Life crept in, work deadlines, bills, routines. The playful banter that once defined us was replaced by curt exchanges, and the passion we once shared turned into a distant memory. Mark stopped noticing the little things, like how I styled my hair differently or the effort I put into planning a special evening. I told myself it was normal, that all marriages went through phases. But deep down, I felt invisible. The breaking point came on our 15th wedding anniversary. I had spent weeks planning a celebratory dinner, his favorite meal, candles casting a soft glow around the room, and a bottle of wine we had saved for a special occasion. I wanted to remind us both of what we had, of what we'd built together. But when Mark came home that evening, he barely noticed. No flowers, no card, not even a quick acknowledgement of the day. He muttered something vague about work and disappeared upstairs without so much as a glance at the effort I had poured into the evening. I sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched plates of food and the candles burning low. A lump formed in my throat as the realization hit me. The man who once adored me now barely saw me. That night, something inside me broke. I couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't keep telling myself everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat, keys, and purse and walked out the door. I drove aimlessly, my chest tight with anger and heartbreak, until I spotted a small, cozy bar on a quiet street. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, a distraction, a moment of escape, or just a place to breathe. But whatever it was, I found more than I could have ever imagined. The bar was quiet, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the faint clinking of glasses. It was the kind of place where people went to lose themselves or find a moment of peace. I slid onto a stool at the bar and ordered a drink, wrapping my hands around the cool glass as I let the weight of the evening settle over me. I hadn't even taken a sip when a voice broke through my thoughts. "Rough night." I turned to see a man seated a few stools away, his dark hair and piercing blue eyes catching me off guard. His voice was warm, his smile easy, and there was something disarming about the way he looked at me, like I wasn't just another face in the crowd. "You could say that," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But my heart was pounding in a way I hadn't felt in years. He introduced himself as Ethan, and I offered my name in return. What started as polite small talk quickly became something more. Ethan had a way of drawing me in, his questions thoughtful, his attention unwavering. It had been so long since someone had truly listened to me, had looked at me like I was more than just a wife, a caretaker, a background fixture in someone else's life. For the first time in years, I felt seen. As the minutes turned into hours, the energy between us shifted. His gaze lingered on mine a moment too long, his laughter felt more personal, and the space between us seemed to shrink. When he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, my breath caught. "You deserve to be noticed," he said softly, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. I should have pulled back, should have ended the conversation and walked away. But instead, I leaned in. His words, his presence, his attention, it awakened something in me I thought had long been buried. The night blurred into a whirlwind of emotions. We left the bar together, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire building inside me. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment, I didn't care. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room bathed in soft morning light. Ethan was gone, but on the pillow beside me was a neatly folded note. "Thank you for a night I won't forget." My heart raced as I held the paper in my trembling hands. Guilt and exhilaration battled for control, but there was no denying it, everything had changed. Returning home, I was greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and the sound of Mark flipping through his morning paper. "Morning," he said without looking up, as if nothing had happened. The ache in my chest was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to confess everything, to demand that he see me, really see me. But I didn't. Instead, I slid into my role as the perfect wife, masking my turmoil behind a practiced smile. 4 days, I tried to convince myself that what had happened with Ethan was a one-time mistake, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But the memory of that night clung to me, and so did the way he made me feel. The guilt was overwhelming, yet so was the pull to see him again. Then, Mark mentioned something over dinner that sent a chill down my spine. "I've got a new business partner joining the firm," he said casually, cutting into his steak. "His name's Ethan Parker. We're having him over for dinner tomorrow night. I think you'll like him, sharp guy, good sense of humor." The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against my plate. My blood ran cold. Ethan. My Ethan. What were the odds? Was this some cruel twist of fate, or had he known all along? That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced. Questions swirled, and my heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. Tomorrow, I would see Ethan again. But this time, it wouldn't be in the quiet intimacy of a bar. This time, it would be in my home with my husband sitting across the table. The next evening arrived faster than I had anticipated. I spent the day in a haze, my hands trembling as I set the table and prepared the house for dinner. Every sound felt amplified, the clink of the silverware, the hum of the oven, all of it a reminder that I was about to face the man who had turned my world upside down. When the doorbell rang, my heart jumped. Mark called out from the living room, "I'll get it." But I couldn't let him. I needed to compose myself, to face Ethan before Mark could see the turmoil in my eyes. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. And there he was. Ethan stood on the porch, the same easy smile on his face that had drawn me in that night at the bar. But now, his charm felt dangerous, laced with unspoken truths. His blue eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my knees feel weak. "Kate," he said smoothly, his voice low and deliberate. "It's nice to see you again." Before I could respond, Mark appeared behind me, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Come on in, man. We've been looking forward to this. Looking forward to this." If only he knew. As we sat down to dinner, every second felt like a balancing act. I focused on the food, on the small talk, on anything that would keep my mind off the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Mark was his usual affable self, oblivious to the storm brewing between Ethan and me. But Ethan wasn't making it easy. His eyes would linger on me just a moment too long, his words carrying double meanings that only I could decipher. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks every time his gaze met mine. It was unbearable. When dessert was served, Ethan leaned back in his chair and casually asked, "Do you mind if I have a quick word with Kate? I have some ideas for the business I wanted to run by her." Mark, ever trusting, waved us off with a smile. "Go ahead. She's got a good head for ideas." I forced a smile as I led Ethan into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment we were alone, I spun around to face him. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, keeping my voice low to avoid alerting Mark. Ethan's expression shifted, his easy smile giving way to something darker. He stepped closer, his voice a mix of mockery and intrigue. "What am I doing here? Kate, don't play games. You think it's a coincidence that I'm Mark's new business partner?" My stomach dropped. "You knew," I whispered, horrified. "Of course I knew," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I've known Mark for years. And when I met you that night, well, let's just say I couldn't resist." The room felt like it was spinning. "You used me," I said, my voice trembling with anger. Ethan's expression softened, just for a moment. "At first, maybe," he admitted. "But then I got to know you. And I realized you're more than just Mark's wife. You're extraordinary, Kate. You deserve to be loved." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to scream at him, to throw him out of my house, but instead, I just stood there, paralyzed by the mix of emotions coursing through me. Anger, guilt, and something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself. You need to leave, I said finally, my voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Is that really what you want? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The logical part of me screamed yes. But the part of me that had felt alive in his presence, that had tasted freedom and passion for the first time in years, wasn't so sure. Please, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. Just go. Ethan studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and walked out of the room. I heard the front door close behind him, and the weight of the evening crashed down on me. I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. But this wasn't over. I could feel it. Ethan wasn't the type to walk away so easily, and despite everything, a part of me wasn't sure I wanted him to. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, staring at the ceiling, I knew I had reached a crossroads. I could keep pretending, keep trying to salvage the life I had built with my husband. Or I could let myself fall deeper into the chaos Ethan had brought into my life. Either way, the choice would change everything. The tension between Ethan and me had become impossible to ignore. Every stolen glance, every unspoken word, was like a thread pulling tighter and tighter, threatening to unravel everything. And then, just as I feared, the thread snapped. It happened on a quiet Sunday evening. Mark was away for a business trip, leaving me alone in the house. I had spent the day trying to distract myself, cleaning, reading, anything to avoid the lingering thoughts of Ethan. But when the doorbell rang, I froze. My heart raced as I approached the door, knowing who it would be before I even opened it. Ethan stood there, his expression calm but his eyes blazing with intent. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. I stepped aside, letting him in even though every rational part of me screamed not to. He walked into the living room, his presence commanding the space. I closed the door behind me, my hands trembling. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't stay away, Kate, he said, turning to face me. I've tried, but I can't stop thinking about you. My chest tightened, a mix of anger, guilt, and something dangerously close to desire. You shouldn't have come, I said, but the words lacked conviction. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. Tell me you don't feel the same, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Tell me you don't think about me, about that night. I opened my mouth to protest, but the truth was written all over my face. I did think about him more than I wanted to admit. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and in that moment, all the walls I had built around myself came crumbling down. We kissed, the kind of kiss that was both desperate and inevitable, as if we had been holding our breath for too long. But just as quickly as it started, the guilt came crashing down. I pulled away, my heart pounding. This is wrong, I said, tears welling up in my eyes. I can't do this to Mark. Ethan cupped my face in his hands, his expression earnest. Kate, I know this is messy. But don't you think you deserve to be happy? His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. And for a moment, I let myself believe him. I let myself think that maybe, just maybe, I could have something more. But reality has a way of catching up with you. And it did sooner than I could have imagined. Mark came home early from his trip, walking through the door just as Ethan and I were sitting in the living room. The look on his face when he saw us together was a mixture of confusion and suspicion. What's going on here? He asked, his tone calm but his eyes sharp. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. But before I could say anything, Ethan stood up. We were just talking about work, he said smoothly, his composure unshaken. Mark didn't seem convinced, but he let it go for the moment. That night, I could feel his unease, the way his eyes lingered on me a little too long, the tension in his movements. He knew something was off, even if he didn't know what. It wasn't long before he found out. A week later, I came home to find Mark sitting at the dining table, a single photo in his hand. It was a picture of Ethan and me, taken at the bar that first night. My heart dropped, the air leaving my lungs as I realized what he had found. Care to explain this? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. I stared at the photo, my mind scrambling for an excuse, an explanation, anything to make this better. But there was nothing I could say. The truth was right there in front of him. I trusted you, Mark said, his voice breaking. And I trusted him. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to speak. Mark, I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen. But it did, he interrupted, his tone sharp. And now everything we built means nothing. His words cut deeper than I thought possible. I tried to explain, to tell him that it hadn't gone as far as he thought, but it didn't matter. The betrayal was enough. Mark packed a bag that night and left, slamming the door behind him. I sat in the silence, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. I had destroyed my marriage, the life we had built together, for something that had no future. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to reach out, but I ignored him. I couldn't face him, couldn't bear to hear his voice or see his face. I needed time to think, to figure out how I had let things spiral so far out of control. But time didn't bring clarity. It brought regret. I realized too late that what I had been searching for with Ethan was something I should have fought for with Mark. But now, it was too late. One evening, Mark returned to the house to collect the rest of his things. We sat down to talk, the conversation heavy with unspoken pain. Why, Kate? He asked, his voice trembling. Why him? I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. I felt invisible, Mark. I felt like you didn't see me anymore. His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. Maybe I didn't. But you could have told me. We could have fixed it. I know, I whispered, my voice breaking. And I'm so sorry. We both cried that night, letting out all the pain and anger we had been holding in. And though it didn't fix what was broken, it gave us a sense of closure. Mark and I divorced quietly, the process painful but necessary. As for Ethan, we tried to make something out of the chaos we had created, but it was doomed from the start. Our relationship had been built on lies and betrayal, and it couldn't withstand the weight of reality. Looking back, I know I made mistakes that cost me everything. But I also learned something valuable. Happiness isn't something you find in someone else. It's something you have to build within yourself, brick by brick. The fallout of my choices was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The days after Mark walked out were eerily quiet, filled only with the sound of my own thoughts. Every corner of the house reminded me of the life we had built together, the laughter, the arguments, the memories. Now, all that remained was an empty shell of what once was, and the realization that I had been the one to shatter it. Mark and I finalized our divorce quietly, without much fanfare. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic scenes, just a shared sadness that hung heavy over every meeting. We divided our belongings, each of us taking pieces of a life we had hoped would last forever. I watched him walk out the door one last time, carrying a box of his things, and felt a profound sense of loss. Not just for him, but for the version of myself that I had lost along the way. As for Ethan, things between us unraveled just as quickly as they had begun. At first, he tried to comfort me, to assure me that we could build something lasting out of the wreckage. But it quickly became clear that what we shared had been forged in chaos and deceit. Our connection, while passionate, was built on unstable ground, and it couldn't withstand the reality of what had happened. One evening, after another tense conversation about where we stood, Ethan looked at me with a resigned expression. "We can't keep pretending this will work, Kate," he said softly. "We both know it won't." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to believe it could, I admitted, my voice trembling. "But you're right. It was never meant to be." We parted ways that night, and I haven't seen him since. His absence left a void, but it was one I knew I needed to fill on my own. I had spent so much of my life looking for validation in others, first in Mark, then in Ethan, that I had forgotten how to find it within myself. In the weeks and months that followed, I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding my life. I started therapy, determined to understand the choices I had made and the reasons behind them. What I discovered wasn't easy to confront. I realized that my infidelity hadn't been about Mark or even Ethan, it had been about me. About the parts of myself I had buried, the needs I had ignored, and the unhappiness I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. Therapy forced me to take a hard look at my marriage, and I came to understand that the cracks had been there long before Ethan entered the picture. Mark and I had drifted apart, both of us failing to communicate our needs or address the growing distance between us. I had felt invisible, and instead of fighting to be seen, I had sought attention elsewhere. It was a hard truth to accept, but it was also liberating. Because if I could take responsibility for my mistakes, I could also take control of my future. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I had abandoned, into reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again, not the wife, not the woman who had made a terrible mistake, but just Kate. I learned how to be alone, how to sit with my thoughts without letting them consume me. And while the guilt and regret never fully disappeared, they began to take up less space in my life. Mark and I spoke occasionally, usually about logistical matters related to the divorce. Each conversation was polite but distant, a painful reminder of what we had lost. I held out hope that someday we might find a way to repair our friendship, if not our marriage, but I knew that would take time if it was even possible at all. As for Ethan, he became a ghost in my memory, a reminder of the mistakes I never wanted to repeat. I deleted his number, blocked him on social media, and avoided the places where I knew I might run into him. Cutting him out of my life completely was painful, but it was necessary. I couldn't move forward if I kept looking back. Looking back now, I see the fallout of my choices as a turning point. It was the moment I was forced to confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding for years. It was messy, painful, and at times unbearable, but it was also transformative. I learned that happiness doesn't come from someone else, it comes from within. And while I had lost so much, I had also gained a deeper understanding of who I was and what I needed to feel whole. The scars of what happened will always be there, a reminder of the mistakes I made and the people I hurt. But they're also a reminder of how far I've come. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine. And for the first time in years, that feels like enough. Months turned into a year, and the pieces of my life slowly began to settle. The pain of losing Mark never completely went away, but it softened over time, becoming a quiet ache rather than a sharp wound. I had learned to navigate the emptiness, to fill the gaps with a renewed focus on myself and the things that truly mattered. Therapy became a cornerstone of my healing. Week by week, I unraveled the tangled emotions that had led me to that fateful night with Ethan. I confronted the loneliness I had buried, the unspoken needs I had ignored, and the patterns that had slowly eroded my sense of self. It wasn't easy to face these truths, but it was necessary. I came to understand that my betrayal wasn't just about Mark or Ethan, it was about me losing sight of who I was and what I wanted. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that love, no matter how strong, cannot sustain itself without effort. Mark and I had both fallen into complacency, assuming that the bond we shared would survive without tending to it. But love needs care, attention, and communication. It needs vulnerability and honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. And while I wished I could go back and change the past, I knew that the only way forward was to carry those lessons with me. As for Ethan, he became a memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when you seek fulfillment in the wrong places. What I had thought was passion and connection turned out to be a distraction from the deeper issues I needed to address. Cutting him out of my life was one of the hardest things I had to do, but it was also one of the most freeing. He wasn't the solution to my unhappiness, he was a symptom of it. Mark and I eventually reached a place of cordiality. We weren't friends, but we were no longer adversaries either. He had moved on, and I respected his decision to rebuild his life without me. I wished him well, truly, and I hoped that one day he might find the happiness he deserved. Through it all, I discovered something I hadn't expected: resilience. The woman who had once defined herself by her relationships was learning to stand on her own. I took up hobbies I had abandoned, made new friends, and explored parts of myself I had long ignored. I realized that I didn't need a partner to feel whole, that my worth wasn't tied to someone else's attention or validation. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely at peace with who I was. If there's one thing I've taken from this journey, it's this: life is messy. Relationships are messy. We make mistakes, sometimes devastating ones, and we hurt people we love. But those mistakes don't have to define us. What matters is what we learn from them and how we choose to move forward. Happiness isn't something you stumble upon. It's something you build, brick by brick, through self-awareness, effort, and forgiveness, both for others and for yourself. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll face it with a clearer understanding of who I am and what I need. And that, for now, is enough. To anyone who's ever felt invisible, who's struggled to find their voice or reclaim their sense of self, I hope my story offers you some comfort. Life doesn't always go as planned, but even in the darkest moments, there's a chance to start over, to rebuild, and to grow. Have you ever faced a moment where one decision changed everything? If this story struck a chord with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that dive into the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that might just resonate with your own journey.